So tonight, I would like to introduce Jon Favreau. He has served as Barack Obama's head speechwriter from 2005 to 2013. Since leaving the White House, Favreau has written and spoken about politics and speechwriting to audiences throughout the world. In 2017, he co-founded Crooked Media, where he's a co-host of Pod Save America. Jon grew up in Boston, graduated from the College of Holy Cross, and now lives in Los Angeles with his wife, Emily, their baby, Charlie, and their dog, Leo, who I must mention is very cute. I've seen a couple Instagram posts. Adorable dog.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nicole. I appreciate that. It's a very nice intro. He is a very cute dog. Thank you, everyone, for having me. In the before times, I might have thought that getting from Los Angeles to Gettysburg would be some kind of a hassle, but having left California a total of 3 times in the last 2 years, there is nowhere I'd rather be than with all of you in person right now. I am so sick of Zoom. So instead of giving a very long speech to a screen, I will just speak briefly at the top so I can answer as many of your questions as possible, and hopefully we can have a real discussion. So one of the most common questions I get about hosting Pod Save America is, how do you stay sane? The news is usually infuriating or terrifying or beyond belief. Politics is frustrating on the good days, depressing on the bad days. Things are just not great. And basically, I have 3 answers. One, I'm a political junkie with a lifelong news addiction that I'm not sure I can recover from here at age 40. 2, I get to work with some of my best friends, and we make each other laugh in moments when we might otherwise want to cry. And 3, I am and forever will be an Obama person. Hope and change. Yes, we can. I drank all the Kool-Aid. Can't help it. This is who I am. My old boss was the greatest mentor anyone could ever ask for. He taught me how to write. He taught me how to think through some of the most difficult problems that presidents face. But the most important thing he taught me was to believe, no matter what, in the possibilities of American democracy. And in the decades since I left the White House, that faith has been tested and shaken, but not yet broken. And I think that's because of him. So I just want to tell you a few quick stories about the most important lessons that Barack Obama taught me about democracy. So first story is about when I met him. It was summer of 2004, and I had been working on John Kerry's presidential campaign ever since I graduated college the year before. I was originally a press assistant, which involved waking up at 4 a.m., getting a lot of coffee. But one day, I got the courage to ask the head speechwriter if I could be his deputy. And he immediately said no. But then one day after that, when the campaign was almost broke and couldn't afford a real speechwriter, I became the most affordable option. And so they hired me to be deputy speechwriter. So a little bit later, when John Kerry accepted the Democratic Party nomination that July in Boston, my job was to make sure that all the convention speeches reflected the message of the Kerry campaign. And so one day I get a call from our chief speechwriter who tells me that there's a problem with the draft of the keynote address being given by the young US Senate candidate from Illinois named Barack Obama. So apparently Obama had written a line in his keynote that John Kerry wanted to use in his acceptance speech. And I was like, okay, so what's the problem? What do I have to do with this? And so my boss tells me that I have to go introduce my 23-year-old self to Obama and personally ask him to change the line a day before he's scheduled to give the speech. So I sheepishly walk into the room where Obama's practicing his speech, mumble something about the line, and then black out for a few seconds. And when I come to, Obama is just glaring down at me within an inch of my face and says, are you seriously telling me I have to change my favorite line in this speech? So great first impression with my future boss. And truthfully, I figured at that point that I would never see or talk to Barack Obama again, which was really too bad because the keynote he delivered the next night was like nothing I'd ever heard from a politician. It wasn't so much a speech about politics as it was a story about America. And was one of the most patriotic stories I'd ever heard. Not the kind of cheap, airbrushed, flag waving, like these colors don't run kind of patriotism. It was deeper and I think truer to our history. It was, as he said, the hope of slaves sitting around a fire singing freedom songs, the hope of immigrants setting out for distant shores, the hope of a skinny kid with a funny name who believes that America has a place for him too. This country has always been, more so than many others, a story that we tell ourselves and the world, a story that we're all created equal, that we all deserve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, the reality of American democracy hasn't always lived up to the promise of that story. But that doesn't mean that we can stop fighting to make it true. Because throughout our history, and especially right now, that story is being contested by people who have a very different vision of what America should be. A country that's run by the few and not the many, by brute power and rugged individualism. And if we don't want to live in that country, we have to start by telling a better story. We have to make clear that for all its faults, for all its sins, for all its messy, infuriating mistakes, American democracy is still worth saving. And that requires persuading our fellow citizens. Which brings me to my next story. So in March of 2008, Obama decided to deliver a major speech on race after a controversy erupted over incendiary comments made by his pastor. Initially, our campaign advised him to play it safe. So they scheduled a quick round of cable interviews that they figured were short enough to avoid getting into too much detail. Their thought basically was, there's no way the man who might become the first Black president was going to get people to rethink their views on race in the heat of a presidential campaign. So why even bother with some big, complicated speech about race? Barack Obama disagreed. He wanted to try. So after campaigning until 10 p.m. the next day, remember it was a Saturday night, he called me to lay out the speech that he would give in Philadelphia just a few days later. And I'll never forget, he's like, campaigns all day. He's very tired. He's obviously going through this big controversy. And he's like, I don't have exactly what I want to say, but I'll just give you some stream of consciousness thoughts. And then you can write a draft. And his stream of consciousness thoughts were like, I want you to say 1, 1A, 1B, 2, 2A. And he just like went through the entire speech in the most lawyerly fashion possible, because that's how his mind works. And I can tell you, the parts of that speech that I wrote were parts that really any politician could have delivered. The parts that Barack Obama wrote were lines like, I can no more disown Reverend Wright than I can my white grandmother. A woman who loves me as much as she loves anything in this world, but who more than once has uttered racial or ethnic stereotypes that made me cringe. Or later in the speech, when he explains and even empathizes with not only Black anger, but white resentment. When he said, quote, the anger is real, it is powerful, and to simply wish it away, to condemn it without understanding its roots, only serves to widen the chasm of misunderstanding that exists between races. These are not lines that any speechwriter or political strategist would have suggested to their boss if they wanted to keep their job or win an election. And after the speech, Obama calls me and he's like, look, I don't know if I can get elected president saying the things I did about race today, but I'm not sure I can get elected president without saying them either. And I'm not sure I would deserve to. He knew that for a country to elect a Black guy named Barack Hussein Obama just a few years after 9/11, he would have to change minds and reach people who didn't just hold different views, opposing views, ugly views, but sometimes racist views. And that certainly wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But it was also the reality, and still is, of living in a very divided country of more than 330 million people. We can run against each other and defeat each other at the polls, but no matter who wins, we are still stuck living in this country with the other side. We are stuck living together in this country. And unless we want to conquer the other side or expel them or secede from them, we have to find a way to live together and work together and be citizens together, because that is the only way that democracy actually works. It requires trying to persuade people who don't always agree with you. It requires empathy, even if people don't always deserve the empathy. It requires meeting people where they are, but then refusing to leave them there, to try your best to try to bring them to someplace better. And that requires, sorry, there's an emergency alert on my phone. And that requires a lot of time, a lot of work, and plenty of perseverance. And that brings me to my last story, which is about the most inspiring moment I ever experienced during my time in politics. So it was the night of the 2008 election, but it wasn't the moment they called the race for Barack Obama. It was earlier, as I was making edits to that night's speech. So the draft ended with a story that we found about a woman from Atlanta whose name was Ann Nixon Cooper. And she had waited in line for 3 hours that day just to cast her ballot. And what made the story so special was the fact that Ann Nixon Cooper was 106 years old. And she was born at a time when she wasn't allowed to vote for 2 reasons: because she was a woman and because she was Black. So as the election results start looking good, Tommy Vitor, my co-host, points out to me that we should probably call Ann Nixon Cooper and tell her that she's about to get a bit of a shout out in a pretty important speech. So we find her number and I give her a call. She picks up and I tell this frail, lovely woman that a man who's about to become the first Black president of the United States wants to mention her in his victory speech. And there's a pause on the line. And during that pause, I begin to think about all that she endured through a century marked by depression and 2 wars and a pandemic, by brutal prejudice and discrimination, a century where she patiently pressed on as a tutor and a church volunteer and a civil rights activist, as a wife and a mother and a grandmother, a century where she somehow lived to see progress she must have only dreamed about as a child: women's rights and voting rights and civil rights. And just then, Ann Nixon Cooper interrupts my thoughts with a very important question about that night's speech. She says, "Will it be on television?" And I told her, yes, it would be on television. So she thought about that and she paused for a while longer. And then she asks, "What channel will it be on?" And I said, "All the channels." And then she said, "I'm so proud. I'm so happy. Finally." And at that point, she started to cry. And I did too. And right at that moment, they called Ohio and the race was over. And everyone starts cheering in the office. And I hid under my desk so I could talk to Ann Nixon Cooper for a few more minutes. Obviously, not all of our White House days after that moment were nearly as inspiring. And the country has clearly seen some pretty dark days since we left. We still are. Right after Trump won, I remember Obama told the White House staff that history doesn't move in straight lines. Sometimes it goes sideways and sometimes it goes backwards. But the promise of democracy, the reason democracy is worth saving, is that we have a say in what happens. And the only guaranteed outcome is what happens if we decide that we are too cynical to keep fighting, to keep trying to change hearts and minds, and to keep believing in what this country can be. And up until this day, that is the lesson that keeps me going the most. So with that, I am very happy to take your questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Favreau. So just to reiterate, we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the event. So for those who are here as participants, you can use the raise hand feature and Nicole will call on you accordingly and ask you to unmute and ask your questions. And then for those here webinar style, you can submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A feature, and that will go until 7 o'clock tonight. And I actually think we have a question right off the bat from the Q&A. It says, can you talk about the processes that go into making policy decisions? Say, for instance, different options around student loan debt relief / forgiveness. To what extent does the consideration of votes added or lost enter those processes?
It's a great question. I will speak for our White House. Is the only one that I can speak for. The policy process is, first of all, it's tough to imagine, like, the federal government is so large. There are so many agencies. You've got all the agencies in the White House. You've got all of the cabinet agencies. You've got political appointees that the president gets to pick. You've got people who are career diplomats who are there for a long time. And so unlike, before this, I had been in a Senate office, which is relatively small. So the policymaking process there's like, 3 or 4 people involved. Then I was in a campaign. A campaign is also like designed to move quickly. And so the policy processes there are also a small group of people designed to move quickly. And I will say that the consideration of votes won or votes lost is obviously a lot more front of mind than anything else, because a campaign and people are trying to win. The White House is completely different. When the federal government tries to make policy, and when policy tries to get, or when policy eventually gets to the president, it goes through so many, like literally dozens and dozens and dozens of people. And so from my perspective as a speechwriter, what would happen is the relevant policy councils would get together, and there would be someone in the White House. So like, let's say student debt, even though we did not, that was not a big issue with us. Although we did some stuff around student debt later in the administration, some limited forgiveness. So there is a domestic policy council in the White House. Education falls under the domestic policy council. They would figure out a policy around student loans, student debt, by talking to the Department of Education, which is a huge agency. Again, a lot of career bureaucrats there, not even political people necessarily. They would get recommendations from the Department of Education. They would get recommendations from all the relevant policy councils in the White House. And then they would sit down with a lot of the other folks in the White House and the White House staff. The other big consideration, and this is particularly true around student debt relief, this is very much true around the potential of a president issuing an executive order trying to forgive student debt, as opposed to getting a legislation passed through Congress. They got to get the lawyers involved. And look, I wouldn't say the problem, the challenge with the lawyers in the White House and in the federal government is their job is to, of course, make sure that everyone is abiding by the law. So they are naturally cautious. So the lawyers usually tell you no on everything. And then you have to figure out whether they are just trying to be their cautious selves, and that this is some kind of policy that the courts are immediately going to strike down or going to find illegal, or is this something that maybe you can push a little bit? And look, I'll give you an example of when I think that we should have pushed harder. We did not issue an executive order on the Dreamers, young immigrants who were born in this country, but whose parents were, or young immigrants who came to this country, as young people, but who've lived in this country their whole lives. We did not issue an executive order protecting the Dreamers until the second term, Obama's second term. And one of the big reasons we didn't is because in the first term, the lawyers told us they didn't think it would pass muster, that they thought courts would strike it down. Now, they weren't sure, and sure enough, it did survive for a couple of years when Obama was still in office. But then the courts have challenged it since then, as particularly during the Trump administration. And, the program is now in limbo. But again, we got to this point where we said, okay, we're going to issue the EO on Dreamers years after it was first floated, partly because you get caught up in this, bureaucratic entanglement where there's lawyers and there's bureaucrats who are always telling you, like, I don't know if we should do this. This is the way it's always been done, blah, blah, blah. So like one of the sort of understated things about, I think, Obama's second term versus first term is some people say, okay, in your second term, you don't care about election anymore, so you're a little bit bolder. That might be part of it. I also think that even the most experienced presidents, or presidents who have experience in government before they become president of the United States, you need a year or two or 3 or 4 just to get used to how you can and can't push the rest of the federal government and the apparatus. And you need to like learn to feel comfortable about like pushing back on a bureaucracy that tends to be inherently more cautious. And I think Obama, by his second term, when you saw A, a lot more executive actions, and B, just a lot more sort of bolder leadership on a host of issues, felt sort of more comfortable doing the job of president in terms of like how you interact with the rest of the federal government. Now, to the other question, one part of the question was like votes won and votes lost. I would say that I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a consideration at all. We obviously had political advisors, but I'll tell you a story that's always stuck with me, which is when it looked like the Affordable Care Act was dead because Scott Brown, Republican, won a Senate seat in Massachusetts after Ted Kennedy passed away. And we had a Republican win a Senate seat in Massachusetts, and then we didn't think we had the votes to pass the Affordable Care Act. And Obama wanted to push ahead anyway and try to pass it and find interesting ways to maneuver through Congress the Affordable Care Act. And Rahm Emanuel, his chief of staff at the time, and some other political advisors told him, if you keep pushing on this Affordable Care Act, you are so unpopular right now. Your agenda is unpopular. We're still recovering from this financial crisis. People are hurting, and you're trying to pass this big government program, even though today people rightly say it was not a big government program. It's not like it was Medicare for all. But at the time, it seemed like a big government program. And if you keep pushing this, you will lose re-election. You will lose re-election. And Obama looked at everyone and he said, you know what? I did not come here to put my approval ratings up on a shelf and admire them. I came here to do what I said I was going to do, or at least try as hard as I can to do what I said I was going to do in the campaign. And if I push through the Affordable Care Act and I lose in 2012, then so be it, because at least I did something that I said I would do. So yes, political considerations went into everything, as it does all the time in politics and with every White House. But I am proud that I worked for a man who, when push came to shove, more often than not, in fact, most of the times I can remember, decided to do what he actually thought was right, as opposed to what he thought was just politically expedient.
All right, looks like we have a lot of hands raised. So I'm going to try to go in order of how I saw them come up, but definitely be patient, guys. And if you feel like you're going to forget it, feel free to throw it in the chat too. We'll keep an eye on it. Okay. Colin, do you want to start? I think I saw your hand first. If you want to unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you for being here. My question is, in light of Justice Breyer retiring and the looming Senate fight over his replacement, how did the White House and President Obama more specifically approach choosing Supreme Court justices, who obviously ultimately ended up being Justice Sotomayor and Kagan? And also, do you think the confirmation process is broken because of how the Republicans in the Senate were able to block Merrick Garland in 2016?
Great questions. I don't remember all the specifics of Kagan and Sotomayor's nomination processes and like exactly why and how he picked them. I do know, just for the Pod Save America episode today that is just came out a couple, like right before I started this, I talked to Kate Shaw, who was in the White House counsel's office when I was in the White House and helped these confirmation processes. And I was asking her, do you think the Biden people, like, did they know this was coming? How prepared were they? And she said, look, I think that they were prepared with names and a short list. And I think they started vetting potential nominees before he even won, before he even took office, before he even won the campaign. And she said, she goes, I'm speaking for them and I shouldn't. She's like, but I know we did that. So, you know, Kagan and Sotomayor were probably both on a short list of nominees even before we took office. And I think what happens is you have a list of potential names that, you know, you get those names obviously from recommendations from White House counsel's office, from organizations, from activist groups, from people on the Hill, right, in Congress, because they have to be confirmed. And then you think about, judicial philosophy, what you're looking for in a justice, what kind of philosophy you're interested in. Obviously, because Barack Obama, as a lawyer, has a legal mind, like he, knew that world very well and had a very good idea of the kind of justices that he wanted to nominate. And then, of course, you got to go through the confirmation process. Is the confirmation process broken? Yeah, of course. The fact that, it's not necessarily the confirmation process that's broken. Again, everything that seems broken goes back to the fact that we have one party that's just deciding to kind of be as obstructionist as possible, right? And not really work with us on anything, which has been the case since at least I was in the White House in 2009. Though I bet the Clinton folks would say the same thing about them, and since as far back as 1994 when Newt Gingrich took over Congress. That's probably where it all started. It will benefit us right now because, McConnell got rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominations, and that obviously led to the ideological split in the court right now, of which liberals are on the losing side of. But now we don't have to get 60 votes to confirm this, Justice Breyer's retirement. Now we only need 50 votes or 51 votes, with Vice President Harris being the tiebreaker. So I think, we'll see what Manchin and Sinema do. Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, since they have given Democrats a bit of trouble over the last year, but they have voted for every single one of Joe Biden's nominees, judicial nominees so far. And Joe Biden has now confirmed a record number of judges in his first year. No other president has gone that fast. And again, Sinema and Manchin didn't cause any trouble for any single one of them. If he ends up nominating the rumored frontrunner, which he may not, but if he does, Ketanji Brown Jackson, she was just nominated and confirmed to the DC Circuit Court, second most powerful court in the land, by a vote of 53 to 44. Not only did she get Manchin and Sinema's vote, she also got Lindsey Graham, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski's vote. So, if he nominates her, then everyone's in the position of saying, why did you vote for her literally 3 or 4 months ago, and now you're not going to vote for her here? So I do think, big picture, is the confirmation process in the Senate broken? Yeah, absolutely. Is that going to work out for Democrats this time around because we need 50 votes to do something and we don't have more than 50 votes? Yeah, probably will.
All right, great. And then I'm gonna try to tie a couple of these questions together. So people want to know kind of how you got into presidential speechwriting and what your goals were when you first went about doing that, and also how you went about designing the speech, and if you and Obama had some quarrels about what you wanted to say compared to what he wanted, and how you went about, come up with a compromise on that.
Great question. How did I get into it? So I went to College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, and we had a Washington semester program for you could do in your junior year. So instead of going abroad, I went to Washington, and I interned in John Kerry's office because he was my home state senator. And you could pick either, did you want to be a legislative intern or a press intern? And if you were a legislative intern, you had to pick your issue. And I liked all the issues, so I was like, I'll just pick press. And it was during the time, this was the spring of 2002, when John Kerry was getting ready to run for president. And so I sat in an office next to his communications director, his speechwriter, his press secretary, and his political advisor. And all the other interns were doing like Senate stuff. And I got roped into a lot of the campaign stuff. And part of that was like, I started writing letters, I started writing press releases, and they thought my writing was good, so they gave me more of it. And then when I went back to Holy Cross, the communications director, David Wade, was like, let's keep in touch. You're a great writer, would love to see if there's something for you on the campaign. Graduate Holy Cross in 2003, go down to the campaign in DC. And I was press assistant, but I just kept writing, and I kept trying to like write press releases and stuff like that. And so, I told that story about how I finally became speechwriter because they couldn't afford to hire a real one. But partly that was because, I just kept at it in terms of writing, and I volunteered to do everything, right? And so I volunteered to do the most menial tasks possible in the campaign, but I also said, hey, if you need help with that press release, I'd love to do it. So that's sort of how I got into speechwriting. And the end of that story of how I had to have Obama take that, was forced to ask Obama to take that line out of his speech, is like, so, you know, Kerry loses and then Obama wins the Senate race. And so I'm out of a job. I'm like, drive back home to Boston. I'm living with my parents. I'm broke. And Robert Gibbs, who had been my boss on the Kerry campaign and then left to go be Obama's communications director, reached out and he said, hey, Obama needs a speechwriter. And he's never used one before. He wrote the 2004 convention speech himself. He doesn't think he needs a speechwriter, but he's going to have one because now he's a senator with a national profile. He's not going to have time to write all his own speeches. And so would you be willing to have breakfast with them in Washington and see if you guys are a fit? So I go down to Washington, his first week in the Senate, we have breakfast. It's the easiest interview I've ever had just because he's so kind and just asked me about my upbringing, my theory of speechwriting. I did not have one, but I did say to him what I told you guys, which is I'm used to speeches from politicians sounding like a collection of sound bites and one-liners and applause lines, and you told a story. And I think that speeches should tell a story because we're attracted to good storytellers, whether it's in a book you're reading or music or anything else. Like that's how we listen. That's how we're moved, is by stories. And the idea that politicians are going to get up there and just like mouth the same cliched rhetoric that every other politician does, it's boring. And you told a story and that's interesting. And he's like, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. And so we ended that meeting and he was like, I still don't think I need a speechwriter, but you seem nice enough. And Gibbs is telling me I need one. So let's give it a whirl. And our process was incredible. I'll never forget the first speech I had to write for him. He was invited to John Lewis's 65th birthday in Atlanta. And he's like, I got to go give this speech. Coretta Scott King is going to be there and Ethel Kennedy and all these civil rights giants. And will you write the first draft of my speech? And I'm like, I am going to write like white dude from north of Boston, 20-something-year-old. I'm going to write your speech in front of all the civil rights giants of the 60s. So I go home and do this draft, read all of John Lewis's books, Walking in the Wind and everything, and spent like a week on it, give him the draft. And he comes back in the next day in the Senate office, and the draft is just like, I can barely see the words that I had typed. And it's just all his little chicken scratch writing. I shouldn't call it chicken scratch because he's a lefty like me, but he's like one of the best lefty handwriters I've ever seen. And so it's covered with his writing, and he comes over to me and he's like, so I made some edits to the speech. And he's like, do you mind if I make these edits? And can I just tell you about why I made them? And I'm like, yeah, man, you're Barack Obama. Like, you can do whatever you want. But it was a real collaborative process where I would send him, he would tell me what he wanted in the speech. I would write a draft. He would mark it up. And then the two of us would just go back and forth. And at first, when I was young and new, anytime he made an edit, I would just take it and not say anything. He was the one, as we continued to work together, who would push me sometimes and say, like, tell me if you don't like my edits. Tell me if you don't think they work, because I think this only works if it's a real collaborative relationship. So when I got a little bit older and I got more confident, I would push back sometimes and say, because he can be a little professorial sometimes. He is a writer first and a speaker second, believe it or not. He wrote Dreams from My Father before he was ever running around giving speeches. So some of the sentences are very, very long. There's a lot of clauses. There's a lot of semicolons. There's a lot of explaining. And so the two of us would work on that, and I'd push back. And sometimes he'd say, oh, that's a good point. And sometimes he's like, nah, this is what I liked it the way I had it. Or he'd say, I get your point. I don't like your vision, but let's work together to figure out something that works. So that was the process. And I think because it was so collaborative and because he was so kind and generous and patient, never yelled at me once in the 8 years that I worked for him, it not only was a more enjoyable relationship and job, but I think it churned out better speeches. Because that's, when you have 30 cooks in a kitchen and the principal doesn't usually meet with the speechwriter, but goes through their chief of staff or communications director and barely sees the speechwriter, that's a recipe for bad speeches. But when the person who's giving the speeches really works closely and knows the person who's writing for them, then you have a better shot at doing some really good stuff.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And Gettysburg also has a Washington semester.
Oh, nice.
Which a number of us have done, including myself. So that's It's a great opportunity. So it's cool to see you've also done it. Anna, I think if you want to unmute, you're welcome to.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So my question is regarding all your experience with media, with speechwriting, and then your more recent experience with podcasting. How has that shaped your perspective or changed your understanding of the way politics are represented in media?
It's a great question, because I think one of my pastimes when I was a speechwriter in the White House was complaining about the media. In fact, I think I complained about the media so much, as did Tommy Vitor, as did Dan Pfeiffer, as did John Lovett. That's one of the reasons we all started Pod Save America. And you know, I was on Twitter as far back as 2010 when I was in the White House, but I didn't tweet until I left the White House in 2013. So I was just like a Twitter lurker. And I think my problem with media and political media has always been that it doesn't do nuance well, it doesn't do context well, it gravitates towards drama, it gravitates towards personalities as the reason for why everything happens, as opposed to structures and systems, right? Like I was a political science sociology major in college, and so my academic background is in systems and structures, structural racism, and like this, you know, the labor movement, all this kind of stuff. Like, this is how I was educated. And so when you get to the actual world of politics and media, and everything's about like, oh, well, this piece of legislation didn't get passed because like Barack Obama didn't have like play a round of golf with John Boehner. It's really frustrating. I think the only thing that's changed my perspective between when I was in the White House and now running a media company is I now get, like, I don't think that the motives of every reporter or journalist or media outlet are always sinister. Like, I don't think they're trying to do this just because like they're trying to get clicks to make money, right? Like, there is some of that in a larger systemic way. But I think that when you're trying to tell a story, when you're trying to keep people interested, right, which is part of the issue with news and media, it's like you want to tell a story to keep people interested. You want an audience. And to get an audience, you're trying to tell an interesting story. And I'll just give you an example over the last year. Every Sunday I try to think, and Monday morning, all right, what's going to be on the pot? And I try to balance in my head, right? Like the White House staffer, campaign person, good government person in my head is like, I want to pick an issue that is the most important, that has the most consequence for people. I don't want to do something frivolous. And then part of me that's like, I also want people to listen to this episode and not tune out, because the only way we get people to change their minds and be active and inspire people to do something is to bring them in and keep them excited and keep them interested. And that balance is difficult because, like, how many A blocks can I do about how Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are still being pains in the ass, right? It's like, what happened yesterday? Well, what happened yesterday is Joe Manchin strolled out of his Senate office and made some ridiculous statement that no one can decipher about whether or not he supports Build Back Better. And we are nowhere closer to a vote. And we're nowhere closer to nothing. And that's all I have to report. But you know what? This package, and specifically the climate provisions in the package, could like change the direction of the planet. It's one of the most important things in Washington. But on a daily basis, when I'm trying to report it to people or talk to people, nothing has changed. And so then you mix in like, what crazy thing has Trump done today, right? Which is not as important and not as consequential, at least right now, but also fun, right? So when we started Crooked Media, our mission statement was we wanted to produce content that informs, entertains, and inspires action. And I try, as does John and Tommy, as does everyone who works here, every day, to balance, to keep those three things in balance as much as possible. So if we are doing something that is just all vegetables and not fun at all, we're not going to get people. If all we do is something that's entertaining and fun and silly, then we're missing out on actually trying to educate people. And by the way, if we're just telling people what's wrong with the world and not telling people what they can do to change it, then we're missing the inspire action part. Then we're just cable news. And so it's tough to do, but now that I'm a media person, I think a lot about trying to keep those three things in balance, which is not completely unlike what you do as a speechwriter, right? You're trying to reach an audience, you're trying to inspire an audience, you're trying to educate an audience, but it's become more of a focus, more of an acute focus, I'd say, running a media company.
Awesome, thank you. So these next couple questions are going to kind of be geared to students and like recent graduates. So it says, one is, what advice would you give to Ryzen students and graduates about school and entering the real world? And also off that, a common complaint in DC is that internships in the federal government are reserved for those who have families that can support them living in an expensive city. Can you discuss what other avenues into public service Gettysburg students who don't have that benefit can go down in the future?
Those are two great questions. I will start with the second question first, which is, living in DC, very pricey now. When I moved to DC, the Kerry campaign, I had no job. They called me the night before commencement. And I was like about to graduate college with no job. And they're like, all right, you can come to DC and be the press assistant, but just want you to know we're only going to pay you $20,000 to be press assistant. And I was like, oh, that's not great. And my parents were like solidly middle class. And so I had to pay $800 a month for a basement apartment in DC on Capitol Hill, and not the greatest section of Capitol Hill. And there were literally like rats in my apartment. And so that's how I did it in DC. But like, one solution, and look, this is not, you can't get think tank jobs or nonprofit jobs or jobs in the Hill or internships in the Hill this way. But I am a huge believer that if you are interested in politics, and even if you're just interested in public service in general, a campaign is a great way to cut your teeth. And campaigns happen in far-flung cities all across the country, many of which are cheaper to live in than Washington, D.C. Like, I remember when we were in the Senate office and then Obama decided to run, I went to Chicago, but Tommy Vitor went to Iowa and was the Des Moines press secretary. He was the press secretary for Iowa for the Obama campaign. And he spent nothing in Des Moines, Iowa. Like, he lived at some place that was like $200 a month and like bought a pickup truck for a couple $100. That's how he lived there. So like, I do think it's more financially viable to join a campaign somewhere. And so I also think campaigns are the closest thing to a pure meritocracy in politics, because since they're so short on resources and short on staff, if you go there and prove yourself and work hard, you are more likely to be promoted, like I was, than you are in a big bureaucratic organization in Washington, D.C. And so, if the Kerry campaign hadn't been broke and I hadn't been willing to just be there and help with speeches because they didn't have anyone else on hand, I never would have become a speechwriter. And so I was, yes, lucky and in the right place at the right time, but it was also the campaign structure that helped me do that. And now I'm forgetting what the first question was.
It was, what advice would you give Ryzen students and graduates about school and entering the real world?
Oh, entering the real world. Yeah, look, this is like the most cliche thing possible to say, but I truly, truly believe it, which is like, do not take a job or go searching for a job because you think it is like the next step for you that can burnish your resume, that like your parents really want you to do it, that you're supposed to do this, right? Like I don't know how many times I had the LSAT book on the shelf. My parents really wanted me to take those LSATs and go to law school. They thought that politics was not paying me much. And that I should go like really make something of myself. And, fortunately, I have the most wonderful supportive parents. And I would tell them like, I just don't want to go to law school. Like, and I know that I know what I'm doing right now is not going to make me a lot of money. I know I'm making $20,000 a year being a press assistant, but I can tell you, I'm like, I know that my heart's not in law school and my heart is in campaigning and politics. And they said, then you should do that. And we will only support you in a limited way, you should know. But if that's what you believe in, you should go do that. And that's how I've been my whole life. Like, look, there was a period in between when I left the White House and started Crooked Media, where Tommy and I started a consulting firm called Fenway Strategies, and we like wrote speeches for nonprofits and celebrities and CEOs here and there, and we made some good money, but it was very boring work. And part of it was we missed the White House, but like, in the process of having all those clients, one of them, a startup, like wanted me to come work for them and full-time be a communications person, their chief marketing officer, wanted to pay me an absurd amount of money. And I was so close to doing it because so many people in my life were like, you can't turn down that kind of money. You just can't, that's crazy. And I was like literally about to sign the contract. And I thought, like, this is crazy. Like, this is not what I want to do with my life. Who cares if I'm going to make this much money? Like, I should be doing what I love. This is what I do with my time. My most precious resource is my time. You only live once. And is this what I want to be doing with my life? And I immediately turned it down. And then within a year, we started Crooked Media, which again, we started with like going to Bank of America and putting $100 in a checking account, the three of us, Lovett and Tommy and I, and had no idea. We didn't take any outside money, had no idea if this would succeed, no idea where our funding would come from. And, now we're this business with 80 people and 15 podcasts, and it's really worked out well, and we got lucky. But you know what? Even if this thing had failed 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I would still be so proud that we did it. And I've been so fulfilled by the job that it just meant the world to me. So I really think about what makes you tick. Think about when you're not just, whether it's what you're studying, whether it's what you do outside of class, what hobbies you have, like think about what really drives you and makes you tick, gets you up in the morning, makes you think, and try your best to pursue a career in that. Obviously, that can be a privileged thing to say too. Like sometimes you just have to work and you just have to make money to survive. I get that. I totally get that. But to the extent possible, try to shape your direction towards something that really drives you and motivates you.
Thank you so much. We are going to try and rapid fire through the end of some of these questions, but thankfully, 3 out of these last few questions are actually fairly similar. So hopefully it's just one slightly longer question.
Cool.
The last people who are going to ask some questions, it was Carter, Emily, Drew, and Emma. And they're all sort of asking, where do you see the future of our American democracy? What are some of the largest threats that we have to the American democracy? Bringing up polarization, the political divide, and some other worrying trends in American politics. I don't know what stands out as most concerning to you and what might be hopeful for our future.
Yeah, I mean, great question. A lot worries me. And look, I think the Republican Party, at least a faction of the Republican Party, half of it or more, has become somewhat radicalized, fully radicalized, since Donald Trump became president. It started before Donald Trump became president for sure. And it's one thing to hold, like I said at my speech at the beginning, to like hold views that people don't agree with, bad views, nasty views. But like, I think what we saw on January 6th, and we've seen over the course of the last several years, is like a greater number of incidents of political violence. And when you have a democracy where there are more instances of political violence, where people think that they need to take up arms, or they're so radicalized that they feel like that violence is the only answer, then I think, we're in trouble. In terms of the solutions, this is really frustrating, and I think about it all the time. Like, you know, I've yelled about the filibuster for years. I hate that. The Senate is an anti-majoritarian institution. The Electoral College is crazy. Gerrymandering is terrible. Here's the problem. Each one of these systemic challenges and systemic threats to democracy they have basically rigged the system. So we have sort of an unfair anti-majoritarian system. But the only way to change that system is to win within the system. There is no, you know, I'm always amused by like abolish the Senate. Yeah, sure, abolish the Senate. Great, I'm on board. Well, how are we abolishing the Senate? Show me the path from here to abolishing the Senate. Show me the path from here to abolishing the Electoral College. You have the Interstate Electoral Compact. That's, you know, some states are signed on. We need a few more, and then maybe we can do something. There's still some legal challenges there. But again, everything ends up back in the cul-de-sac of the only way we change things is to win within the unfair system that we have. And the way to win within the unfair system that we have is to persuade people who don't necessarily agree with us that they should vote with us. And I'm speaking, of course, from the Democratic point of view. You guys might have different political persuasions. That's okay. But I worry that for all the, you know, I do think like sort of this radical faction of the Republican Party is very threatening and scary, particularly people who embrace violence. But the other worry I have is that the rest of us, people who are trying to maintain democracy and save democracy, will feel so cynical, that we'll feel so hopeless, that we will just give up, that we'll say it's not worth it, that like Joe Biden's administration disappointed me. I worked really hard in 2020. He's not getting everything done that I wanted done. And what is the point anymore? And I think social media does this, and the internet does this too, where it's like you're online and you're very familiar with the people who share your views. You're very familiar with the people who have diametrically opposed views because they're very loud as well. And we don't think that there's anybody left who is persuadable in the country. And that's just not true. And I know it's not true because, you know, I do this podcast. I'm going to do another season of it called The Wilderness. And it's about the Democratic Party. And as part of The Wilderness in the last couple of seasons, I did focus groups. And you do these focus groups. And again, focus groups are just 10, 14 people, right? It's not a poll of 1,000 people. It's a small sample, but you know, it's social science. They're representative. You do it, they're demographically representative, and you do enough of them. And you start hearing the same thing, which is there's a lot of people out there with extremely complicated views. I sat there in Milwaukee, Wisconsin with 14 people who voted for Barack Obama and voted for Donald Trump. Crazy. One guy is like, I voted for Barack Obama, and then I voted for Bernie Sanders, and then I voted for Donald Trump, and I think weed should be legalized, but I don't like immigrants, but I think there should be Medicare for all. And you're just like, what is going on here? Some guy was like, I voted for Barack Obama because I thought it was really inspiring to have the first Black president. I thought that was great. But I also thought Trump just told it like it is. You're like, what? So like, that is very frustrating. But it should also, deep in there is something hopeful, right? Which is that like, it is more possible than we think to persuade people to change their minds or to do something different. And I think we need to also view persuasion as not just, you know, in democratic politics, you have people who are like, well, forget about persuading centrists and moderates. We should be talking to our base and turn out the base and turn out a lot of non-voters. And the idea is that like non-voters look exactly like the Democratic base, act like the Democratic base, and basically all they're waiting for is someone to just knock on their door and be like, hey, go vote. And that's really not the case. Demographically, they look like our voters, but a lot of times they're even more cynical. They're not necessarily progressive on every single issue. They have complicated views. They don't pay much attention to politics. And so even a base turnout strategy, even a non-voter turnout strategy requires sitting down and talking to people who don't necessarily have your viewpoints and trying to bring them along. And I think it's both my worry and my hope. My worry is that we will give up on that. My hope is that it makes me think that a better politics and a better democracy is possible. And again, like, you know, I have this like democratic messaging expert that I've talked to a lot on Pod Save America, and she was on The Wilderness. Her name is Anat Shanker Osorio. she said that after the 2020 election, she talked to a lot of her friends who did the same work in different countries all around the world. And what they all said to her was, there's never been a authoritarian movement that was beaten at the ballot box. Like, you guys, Donald Trump was in power, and via just plain old democracy, just voting, we voted him out of office. And if that's possible, if it was possible once, that it's possible again. And so as dark as it becomes, as worrying as the threats of democracy are, I really do believe it is in our hands. And as stacked against us, as stacked against democracy as the system is, as rigged as it seems, it's still possible to persuade enough people to come along within an unfair system and maintain a healthy democracy. We're not there yet, but I think we can get there.
All right. Thank you so much, Jon, for your time. Fortunately, guys, we have run out of time. This has been a wonderful hour. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to those who are participants, and thank you to everyone who sat in the webinar as well. We invite everyone to join the Eisenhower Institute next Thursday for the U.S.-China relations. How did we get here? The EI undergraduate fellows will host a discussion featuring Ambassador J. Stapleton Roy of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute and Dr. Bonnie Lin of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. There is more information in the chat about that. Again, thank you so much, Jon. If you have any last words, really appreciate your time today.
I just want to say how the discussion was great. The questions were fantastic. I really appreciate you all asking them. And sorry, I gave super long answers. I wish we could have had time for more questions, but thank you for joining tonight, and appreciate it.